to introduce the first speaker today. I'm going to ask Adrian Lotson, who's one of our graduate students, to introduce the speaker.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Josef and I go back quite a way, so I'm going to read this introduction that we have here for him, but we go back to our days as FT, Fund for Theological Education Fellow, so I'm really excited to have him here. Our first conversation was about my days as a sports attorney when I was investigating his undergraduate institution, Oral Roberts University, and I was trying to find out how much money he had been giving to basketball players during the time that he was there. So we segue from conversations about corruption and intercollegiate athletics to religion and popular culture. So Josef Sorett is assistant professor of religion and African American studies at Columbia University. An interdisciplinary historian of religion in America, Sorett's work addresses black communities and cultures in the United States. His research and teaching interests include American religious history, African American religions, hip-hop, popular culture and the arts, gender and sexuality, and the role of religion in public life. He earned his PhD in African American studies from Harvard University, his BS from Oral Roberts, and his MDiv from Boston University. He has received countless fellowships, is widely published, and is considered one of the leading new voices in African American culture and religion in the United States of America. So I am really, really excited to have him here and to have him talk about things related to spirit, religion, and black folk.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Adrian, again for that introduction. Thank you, Brian, for the invitation, and thank you, Berna, for all of your help in getting things set up this morning and making things smooth. It is indeed an honor. I'm excited to be the first of this great day, this roster of presentations. Our other presenters, Michael Eric Dyson, of whom's work I have been a big fan for a long time, and then Marla Frederick in the evening, who was one of my faculty while in the early stages of the PhD program at Harvard. So it's glad to be the starting voice in this longer day of a real rich conversation. I also want to acknowledge the support and presence of my dear senior colleague, Farah Jasmine Griffin, whose work and presence at Columbia is an inspiration. When she told me last week that she was coming, then I really got the sense that I needed to be able to say something, right? And so it's a pleasure to be here and have this conversation. My title talk for this morning is Spirit in the Arts, Black Religion, and the Problem of the Popular. In many ways, black religion has figured as the perennial problem in popular form in the West. Since the advent on the fields of American slavery, it has simultaneously been both an ultimate other relegated to the margins and a source of inspiration for a range of more celebrated American cultural forms. On one hand, we can quickly recall the migration studies of the early 20th century, which framed the folk religious practices of Southern blacks and what they brought from the South north as a threat to the public health of the newly burgeoning American metropolises, and as an impediment to their development as modern citizens. On the other hand, it is impossible to imagine the emergence of musical forms like jazz and the blues without accounting for the role of black migrants like Thomas Dorsey, formerly Georgia Tom, and others, in the roots of these forms in the very same cultures of the American South. Additionally, despite the ebbs and flows of academic thinking regarding the significance of religion in American culture, black religion has maintained a certain singularity in the American imagination. That is to say, when simplistic secularization theses were in vogue and religion was thought to be a fading phenomena of a primitive past, and even when theologians were conceding that God was dead, black religion continued to be understood as the exceptionalist foil to a master narrative of religious decline. Even today, African Americans are still often perceived as hyper-religious or especially and uncritically loyal to their churches. If we think to 2010, for example, of the debate that arose during the first few months of that year regarding the significance of the black church in the United States, what began as an elegiac essay announcing the death of the institution on the Huffington Post by a Princeton professor provoked a visceral response from black churchgoers across the country. It ignited an online dialogue amongst academics and clergy and sparked a plethora of posts across the blogosphere. Eventually, the exchange was covered in the New York Times, which then inspired several radio stories, including a series of interviews on NPR. If nothing else, participants in these conversations seem to agree that black churches are no longer, and perhaps never were, the politically progressive institutions they are assumed to be, and the countless invocations of Martin Luther King, Jr. that still prevail in American public life. Ironically, as folks were clamoring to debate its death, this conversation worked to claim perhaps a novel sort of popularity for black churches in the public sphere. Yet at precisely the same moment that scholars were arguing about the life and death of Afro-Protestantism, the New Yorker magazine, one of the nation's premier intellectual publications, printed 2 articles in which black churches stood at the creative and critical center. Written by Khalifa Sane and Hilton Alls, respectively, these stories focused on 2 arguably black church culture workers, the gospel musician Tone and the popular playwright, now media mogul Tyler Perry, who are both fixtures on the buckle of what Mark Anthony Neal has referred to as the Black Bible Belt. For Tone and Perry, black churches provide both their core audience and aesthetic cues. Interestingly, the New Yorker articles went relatively unnoticed by those concerned with black churches, professors, preachers, and lay people alike. At first glance, this might seem appropriate, as neither article was about religion per se. Of course, we could take into account that one is a print publication and the other is online and access to media and of the different audiences that these type of media address. But more germane to my concerns today, both pieces pointed to inextricable ties between aesthetics in religion and black culture. That the essays were overlooked says much about how perceptions of African American religion tend to be overdetermined by a political lens. In this regard, the public debate over black churches appears to be an extension of recent academic concerns taken up in several books by folks like William Hart, Curtis Evans, and Barbara Savage. What is also interesting in these debates, and in these 3 books specifically, is the way in which the relationship between black churches in particular and black religion more generally is understood. While the latter 2 books mentioned here explore the politics that produced a certain privilege for black Protestant institutions, only the first focuses more specifically on disentangling the idea that the black church, or Christianity in general, has the definitive word on what constitutes black religion. I'll return to this later. However, the fact that politics are perceived as paramount with regards to black religion should still at least be a little bit surprising, as gospel music is arguably the only entity associated with black church culture that maintains more popular currency than Dr. King. To clarify, the arts, whether it be the spirituals, gospel music, the chanted sermon, have been perceived as paradigmatic in African American religious history, yet aesthetics as a site of inquiry and analyses of African American and thus American religion more generally remains relatively underdeveloped. I take up this task here examining how religion has figured into efforts to theorize black art and culture. I want to explore the complexities of how African American artists and intellectuals at particular moments in the 20th century have engaged religion in efforts to theorize an aesthetic that reflected black people's everyday lives, the popular. More specifically, through an engagement with the critical debates associated with the New Negro movement and the work of some of the Harlem Renaissance usual suspects, figures that are typically cast as modern, secularizing, profane even, I show religion, and black popular religion in particular, to be a mediating discourse in debates regarding art, politics, and culture. And paying attention to these debates central to the Harlem Renaissance, we're provided with an opportunity to explore how African American artists and intellectuals use categories such as church and spirit to interrogate the idea of the black church, even as it was just becoming popular. To do this, I want to take a couple of specific smaller steps, moving backwards from this present debate to the 1920s and 30s and a closer look at how religion showed up in debates around the New Negro aesthetic. First, by way of explaining my title, I want to offer a concrete example and perhaps inspiration as a point of departure for thinking about some of the problems and questions attendant to this language of church and spirit as it pertains to the problem of the popular. And then I want to focus more of my time on how all 3 of these ideas of race, of church, of spirit coalesce in a particularly celebrated moment of African American culture expression, namely the Harlem Renaissance. First, with regards to my title, when one thinks of the relationship between religion and aesthetics and race in American history, a figure like James Baldwin immediately comes to mind. Whether offering a prophetic indictment of the role of Christianity in the colonial enterprise abroad and Jim Crow segregation at home, as he did in The Fire Next Time, or in drawing on the cadence, sounds, and styles of black church traditions in such plays and novels as Amen Corner and Up Above My Head, most famously in Go Tell It on the Mountain, there's arguably no writer who so masterfully captured the aesthetic power of black churches as James Baldwin. Yet the prominence that Baldwin provided for the black Christian vernacular as but one iteration of black religion in the realm of literature pales in comparison to the popularity that many black musicians achieved at roughly the same time, with performances so deeply and at times overtly indebted to practices that have been cultivated over time within black churches. Singers such as Sam Cooke, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, each with their own unique performances of black masculinity, were all influenced by the spiritual and cultural forms of Afro-Protestantism. Yet no one so brilliantly and boldly navigated the waters of black popular music, sacred and secular, to reach both mass popularity and receive critical praise as the daughter of the preacher man, namely Aretha Franklin. When we think about the question with which I began, that of the relationship between politics and art in African American religion, it's important to remember that while the general American public may perhaps prefer preachers who resemble Dr. King, King's favorite preacher and a much more popular preacher in black churches at the time was Aretha's father, the Reverend Clarence LaVaughn C.L. Franklin. With his presence on the radio and the revival circuit, the aesthetics of Franklin's preaching more often than not trumped the politics of King's activism. Of course, this distinction is in part about class, with Franklin's formal education beginning in the Mississippi cotton fields and ending in grade school, and King's culminating with a PhD from Boston University. The men offered two distinct preacher performances that resonated with different sorts of audiences across lines of race and class. Yet their differing reception also pertains to the relationship between what are often perceived discreetly as black religion on one hand and American religion respectively. To be overly simplistic, if an advocate on behalf of the poor, King was a preacher from and for the black elite. In contrast, we might think of Franklin as the people's preacher. Today, however, I'm only interested in C.L. Franklin insofar as he was Aretha's daddy, and how the cultural repertoires of the black churches, which the father led, continue to be central to the aesthetic vision of the daughter. Of course, Aretha grew up singing with her father in church and began recording as a professional singer of gospel music. And while her mainstream secular success earned her the moniker of the Queen of Soul, to date, the best-selling album of her career was a return home of sorts to gospel music in 1972 with her album Amazing Grace. I want to pause for a minute to play an excerpt of a performance of her popular 1970 song, the title track from her album, Spirit in the Dark.
You're wonderful. You're beautiful. Thank you very much. Sometimes I get a good feeling, yes I do. This feeling of mine, I know what it is, but oh yeah, sometimes I wonder about you, yes I do. I wonder if you get the same feeling too. Yeah, can I hear you say yeah, 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 yeah. I wonder are you getting the spirit in the dark? Are you getting the spirit in the dark? People move. Oh, tell me now, ain't we grooving? Getting the spirit, getting it in the dark. In the dark. feel like dancing. Get up and let's start dancing. Start getting the spirit. Get in the spirit. Get in the dark. In the dark. This is how I go. It's like Sally Wall. Sitting in a sauce. That's how you do it. It ain't nothing to. Right, Sally, right. The hands on your hip, and on your eyes, and move with the spirit. Move with the spirit. Come on, move with the spirit. What we have to do with the spirit. Are you getting the spirit? Getting it in the dark. Are you getting the spirit? Getting it in the dark. People moving. Ah, tell me, ain't we grooving? Yeah. Get in the spirit. Oh, getting it in the dark. In the dark. It's like Sally Wall. Sitting in a sauce. That's how you do it. Ain't nothing to. Right, Sally, right. Put your hands on your hip. Go on and cover your head. With the spirit. Move. With the spirit. Move. With the spirit. We're feeling good and move. With the spirit. I think I got it. All my brothers with me, all my sisters with me. Move with me, move with spirit. Feel it with me, and just move with spirit. Put it in your hand, like I know you can. Get it in your feet, stay on the beat, and move with spirit. Move with spirit. Come on, move with spirit. I feel, I believe I got it. I feel, I think I got it. Yeah, I'm gonna move with spirit. Yeah, I'm gonna move with spirit. I feel it. Oh, yes, I do now. Feel. Oh, yes, I do now. I'm gonna move. Move it. Come on. Come on and go with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Aretha Franklin. Miss Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin. Aretha Franklin. Miss Franklin. Mrs. Franklin.
Thank you very much, every one of you, for coming out. And should we come back, you do come back again. Thank you.
Apologies again, as Aretha takes us to church. Beyond the sheer power and presence of her performance, there are multiple readings that might be rendered regarding this song. What might Aretha have meant by referencing the spirit in the dark? Is this some sort of theological statement on the transition of a black church performance from the light of a Sunday morning to the dimly lit rooms and dark nights of the nightclub where this song was often and where we see it performed here? Or perhaps it was an ode to a newly celebrated black identity in the same year that Tony Cade's The Black Woman and Addison Gale's The Black Aesthetic were published, directly after a decade in which Africa was rediscovered outside of the colonial gaze on the so-called dark continent. Perhaps she is simply elevating a celebration of dark bodies moving and swaying. At least for today, I'm less concerned with settling these questions, as interesting as they might be, but rather what I'm concerned with is the way in which the song, even in its title, suggests something about a relationship between the cultural repertoires of black churches so powerfully on display here and the notion of a spirit that might be alive within those churches but surely spans far beyond the walls of any institutional configuration. One thing that the song does do is help to foreground this question of the relationship between the performative and the aesthetic dimensions, that which is perhaps most popular about black churches, and the significance of some broader notion of a spirit which traverses ideas of sacred versus secular, as well as more specific Christian distinctions between the church and the world. In fact, it is both the anxiety and the anticipation attached to the very possibility that one might catch, feel, or be moved by the Spirit, whether in the dark or the light, that at least in part makes certain dimensions of this popular culture so popular. Indeed, Aretha's soulful ruminations in Spirit in the Dark invites a more complicated rendering of the cultural and political afterlives of black churches. Indeed, on display in the climactic moment of Aretha and her ensemble's performance of Spirit in the Dark is what W.B. Du Bois referred to as the frenzy and of the faith of the fathers, the 10th chapter of his now classic 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folk. This language of spirit, as we look back to the souls of black folks, souls has perhaps dominated the discourse for thinking about the interiority of black folks' existence. But I'm interested in discerning the meaning, the signifying behind a certain spiritual grammar that is evident in the work and writings and criticism of a number of black artists and intellectuals in the early part of the 20th century and continuing up through the moment when Aretha records this song. Of course, within Souls of Black Folk, a text which is bracketed itself with prayer, Du Bois, alongside of his discussion of the frenzy, frames the preacher and the music as central in his analysis of the Negro church. On the one hand, the institution of the Negro church is foregrounded, but then Du Bois ends the book with his final chapter, The Sorrow Songs, with this particular aesthetic dimension that may have nurtured a specific Christian theological tradition, but is much more broader, in which the Spirit ruminates and encompasses and interprets the entirety of black folks' existence. Du Bois argued that this was, on one hand, the message of the slaves to the world, but it was also the first distinct American cultural form. How are we to understand the relationship between the faith of our fathers as institutionalized in the Negro church and the aesthetics and broader theological vision apparent in the spirituals? If one were to jump forward to 1925, to Du Bois's slightly less popular work, The Gift of Black Folk, the height of the Harlem Renaissance, Du Bois closes the book with two chapters, one entitled Negro Art and Literature and another entitled The Gift of the Spirit, where his arguments, which now smacks of what we refer to as romantic racialism, argues that both art and the spirit are essential to the gifts that African Americans bring to the West. Du Bois deploys the spiritual grammar in his effort to theorize the role of African Americans in the American nation, but also their contribution to the cultural civilizations of the West. A number of artists would join him in those years, and what I want to, as an analytical frame that emerges in their efforts to interpret black culture at this particular moment, at the high point of what was a longer New Negro movement that began at the turn of the 20th century, what I refer to as a trope of church and spirit emerges in the discourse. I want to explain for a moment what I mean by church and spirit. To do so, we might briefly turn to the story behind the most familiar document associated with the Harlem Renaissance, Alain Locke's ambitious edited volume, The New Negro. In 1925, the same year that Du Bois's Gift of Black Folk was published, Locke edited a commissioned edition of the monthly periodical Survey Graphic entitled Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro, which became the core of the much larger anthology. Significant here is that Locke opted not to reprint the one contribution specifically on religion and black churches in particular in the Survey Graphic issue, George Edmund Haynes' essay, The Church and the Negro Spirit. Haynes was directly connected to the Harlem Renaissance, helping to found the National Urban League, which supported budding black literary talent through contests in its publication opportunity. But he was also an active Presbyterian layperson and longtime secretary of the Federal Council on Churches Commission on Church and Race Relations. His commitments are made clear in this essay as he affirms black churches as, quote, visible evidence of the struggle of an aspiring people to express the best of life within them. For Haynes, churches were the institutional embodiment of a black inner life. So at the center of his rendering of Harlem were two entities. On one hand, church. On the other hand, the Negro spirit. Significantly, the connection that Haynes posited between the church and the Negro spirit was not the isolated observation of one of the most prominent black liberal Protestants of the day. Rather, it was a distinction repeated by many of the most celebrated figures associated with the Harlem Renaissance, regardless of a religious affiliation or a lack thereof. However, while Haynes claimed that churches were evidence of a rising Negro spirit, others insisted to the contrary that Christianity inhibited the flourishing of a distinctly racial art. For instance, at times, both Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois argued that churches played a pivotal role in stalling a tradition of black art, thus inhibiting the flourishing of a new Negro spirit. Indeed, whether black churches cultivated or circumscribed the racial aesthetic figured as a formidable question for new Negro artists and intellectuals. This trope of church in spirit is readily visible in popular accounts of the day, including James Weldon Johnson's Black Manhattan, Richard Wright's essay Portrait of Harlem in the WPA volume New York Panorama, and Claude McKay's Harlem Negro Metropolis. While Haynes framed churches exclusively as in service to the Negro spirit, others employed the trope to account for a wider range of black religious practices and traditions in Harlem. For instance, Claude McKay's Harlem Negro Metropolis covers everything from messianic figures like Father Divine and Marcus Garvey to, quote, sex, cults, the occult, and much more. McKay's interpretation of the relationship between a great American institution and, quote, the religious energy of the black masses reveals just how widely this trope of church and spirit was applied. Indeed, in McKay's view, black people possessed a unique spiritual tradition that was, quote, not the same as white folks' religion, and even conversions to Christianity or Islam took place, as he put it, on pagan terms. While churches were conduits through which the religious heart of the Negro was present to America, quote, the religion of the Negro people stirs and swells over the confines of the Negro church and pours over into the glorious streams of cults and fetish tributaries. It is immersed in African magic. McKay continued, but the church is no adequate outlet for the burning religious energy of the black masses. Ultimately, black churches and the spiritual life of the race was not to be conflated with American Christianity. Rather, as McKay concludes, it was only explainable by tracing back to its original African roots. In 1926, 1 year after the publication of The New Negro, a debate emerged amidst the budding Harlem Renaissance. The NAACP's publication, Crisis, featured a series of essays on black art, including a printing of Du Bois's now classic Criteria of Negro Art speech. A group of ambitious black artists joined forces to found the short-lived but celebrated journal Fire, and in June of that year, the popular weekly periodical The Nation published essays by two of Harlem's most promising young writers, George Schuyler and Langston Hughes. Schuyler, who came to be known as the Sage of Sugar Hill, made a name for himself as satirist par excellence on race matters in 1931 with his debut novel, Black No More. Black No More relates the story of a scientist who makes millions off of a machine that turns black people white. However, before Black No More, Schuyler had begun to establish himself as an independent mind and journalist provocateur. His sardonic essay, The Negro Art Hokum, which appeared on June 16th, fit squarely in this tradition. In short but theatrical fashion, Schuyler sarcastically dismisses the idea of a racial art as, quote, self-evident foolishness. He insisted that artistic expressions credited to black people such as the spirituals, blues, and jazz were more accurately attributed to regional and class differences than to any particular racial characteristic. He found religious life to be especially illustrative of this fact. Drawing comparisons across the color line, Schuyler explained that the Negro reads the same Bible and belongs to the Baptist, Methodist, and Episcopal and Catholic Church. It is sheer nonsense to talk about racial differences as between the American black man and the American white man. Always quick to deconstruct popular racial and religious presuppositions, Schuyler critiqued black churchgoers as mirrors of their white counterparts. In his view, they were, quote, lamp-blacked Anglo-Saxons. As such, the idea of a racial aesthetic, never mind the Negro spirit, was implausible. The following week, Langston Hughes' essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, appeared as a rejoinder to Schuyler. As much as any other black artist or critic of the day, Hughes engaged all points of the spectrum between church and spirit. He wrote journalistic essays for the Chicago Defender on the many functions of particular black church practices. In his autobiography, he reflected candidly on the role that religion played in his own upbringing. He penned several gospel plays, including Tambourines to Glory, Jericho, Jim Crow, The Gospel Glory, and the highly acclaimed Black Nativity, which continues to be performed in the holiday season in cities around the country. And religious themes appear often in his poetry and prose. The richness of Black religious life figures prominently throughout the many genres in which he wrote. While scholars sharply dismissed the idea of a tradition of racial art, Hughes argued to the contrary. Framed within a personal critique of an unnamed County Cullen, he offered an apologia for artistic freedom, as well as an argument in favor of a distinct racial aesthetic. In his estimation, Cullen's desire to be labeled simply a poet rather than a Negro poet exposed a deeper desire. He wished to be white. Where Cullen equated the shedding of the adjectival Negro with excellence, Hughes claimed that it revealed an unstated, quote, desire to run away spiritually from his race. While he stopped short of elaborating his spiritual diagnosis, Hughes drew upon this language of spirit to frame the bond that he believed Black artists shared. And more specifically, he elevated a particular form of Afro-Protestantism, namely the churches of the Negro masses, as an aesthetic resource. Conceding scholars' point, Hughes agreed that there were Black churches that were modeled after Caucasian patterns and were inclined to, quote, an aping of things white. But where Schuyler pointed to this mimicry as evidence of the implausibility of a racial art, Hughes offered an implicitly class critique. Nurturing a racial spirit among new Negro artists did not necessitate that Black churches be displaced, as Locke and Du Bois suggested, nor, as Schuyler argued, did it mean that African Americans were simply white Christians in blackface. Hughes explained that there were indeed Black churchgoers who, quote, did not particularly care whether they are like white folks or anybody else. Invoking the Black Christian vernacular, he writes, "May the Lord be praised, their religion soars to a shout." In Hughes's estimation, Black folk churches held on to their cultural distinctiveness. While members of elite Black churches sought to worship the Lord correctly and quietly, these churches were well equipped to, quote, give the world its first truly great Negro artist, the one who is not afraid to be himself. Of course, Hughes's analysis does not account for the degree of cultural exchange across class lines within Black communities, and he fails to explicitly acknowledge even the class nature of his claim. Never mind that he romanticized these churches as entirely free from any outside influence. That said, Hughes' insistence that the churches where the, quote, low-down folks, the so-called common element, worshipped, were among the few sites that displaying a distinct Black culture. Ultimately, while Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston parted ways over a dispute regarding the co-authored but unfinished comedic play Mulebone, Hurston was a close confidant and collaborator with Hughes. An anthropologist and folklorist, Hurston is best known for her novels such as Jonah's Gourdvine and Their Eyes Were Watching God. Featuring characters, male and female, chiseled deep within the Du Boisian veil of Black life, Hurston's novels infrequently figure white folks as major actors. Her essay, Characteristics of Negro Expression, first appeared in the British heiress Nancy Cunard's enormous 1934 collection, Negro, an anthology. In it, Hurston offers a rich portrait of cultural life in the southern Black Belt states that well complemented Hughes's aesthetic credo. Trained at Barnard and Columbia under the noted anthropologist Franz Boas, Hurston attended to the descriptive task of delineating the most prominent features of Black culture, culled from ethnographic fieldwork in Black communities in the South. Like Hughes, she was fascinated with folk. And she similarly pointed to religion as a marker of racial difference. For instance, she critiqued the tendency of educated Blacks to slavishly imitate, in Hurston's words, whites in everything from fashion and beauty to their willingness to, quote, endure a boresome church service. But according to Hurston, such facsimiles were not to be confused with the value Black people gave to mimesis. While the educated minority were often, quote, apes of all the mediocrities of the white brother, for the vast majority of Black folk, whom she described as the Negro farthest down, the man in the ditch, mimicry was an intrinsically rewarding art form. Quote, he mimics for the love of it, Hurston writes, and not because he wishes to be like the one imitated. In Characteristics, Hurston outlined a code of values embedded in the expressive culture of Black life. In her treatment of Negro folklore and culture heroes, the subject of religion emerges most forcefully. In short, Hurston argues that contrary to popular opinion, quote, the Negro is not a Christian, really, end quote. She explains, The primitive gods are not deities of too subtle inner reflection. They are hard-working bodies, gods of physical violence, stopping at nothing to serve their followers. Characters imbued with otherworldly qualities in Christian traditions, such as God and the devil, were now part of a cast of formidable embodied figures who acted concretely in human history. In black culture, Hurston maintained, quote, God and the devil are paired and are treated no more reverently than Rockefeller and Ford. In this ensemble, the devil could be smarter than God, and divine attributes are assigned to a host of animals. Referencing the African-American folk hero High John the Conqueror, Hurston claimed, quote, Jack beats them all. Most significantly, Hurston concludes that Southern black culture was a repository of African cultural retentions. Paralleling similar arguments by Melva Herskovits, Boaz's more famous student, Hurston observed that the most powerful folk heroes always drew strong resemblances to the trickster figures celebrated in West African societies. While some looked to distant Africa for a racial spirit, Hurston claimed that those spirits had survived the trauma of the Middle Passage and now resided on the same southern soils that hosted the stronghold of American slavery. From Hurston's perspective, black folk cultures, especially in the South, remained deeply indebted to the cosmologies of West Africa, and it was therein that one could readily discern a racial aesthetic. While Hurston portrayed the black South as deeply shaped by an African past, 3 years later, Richard Wright offered a materialist account of the region in his essay Blueprint for Negro Writing, published in the journal edited by Dorothy West, New Challenge, in 1937. Wright was one of many black artists and intellectuals shaped by a constellation of Marxist ideas and organizations during the 20s and 30s. In Blueprint, he posited a vision of a national culture in the Deep South where, despite years of migration north and west, blacks were still most densely concentrated. According to Wright, new Negro artists had accomplished little for the majority of black folk, in particular because they were the victims of their own racial insecurities or the pawns of white patronage. He dismissively likened them to, quote, French poodles who do clever tricks. As a corrective, he put forward his own 10-point plan. First of all, Wright argued, if the work of Negro writers was to provide concrete benefits for a significant number of people, they would have to learn from black workers organizing in the South and, quote, take advantage of their unique minority position. There was, he continued, a culture of the Negro in which his and has been addressed, the culture of the Negro which is his and has been addressed to him, a culture which has for good or ill helped to clarify his consciousness and create emotional attitudes which are conducive to action. And according to Wright, quote, this culture has stemmed mainly from two sources, the Negro church and the folklore of the Negro people. Wright's Marxist commitments are well known and helped explain the common perception him of critically dismissive of religion. However, in Blueprint, he places religion, specifically the Negro church, at the center of his argument in support of a model for black writing. According to Wright, quote, it was through the portals of the church that the American Negro first entered the shrine of Western culture. Disconnected from Africa and enslaved in North America, he asserts the efforts of black people to worship freely in the context of slavery amounted to, quote, a struggle for human rights. However, the ensuing history of black churches was one of decline from revolutionary struggle until religion began to serve as an antidote for suffering and denial. Now, he surmised, the vast majority of African Americans remained oriented by a, quote, archaic morphology of Christian salvation that left them ill-equipped for the demands of modern society. Still, Wright pointed to churches as primary channels through which the racial wisdom flowed. As a result of the experience of enslavement and segregation, there was a resulting, quote, Negro way of life. But it was not the result of African cultural retentions, as Hurston contended. Rather, Wright explains, quote, the Negro people did not ask for this, and deep down, though they express themselves through their institutions and adhere to this special way of life, they do not want it now. This special existence was forced upon them from without by lynch rope, bayonet, and mob rule, end quote. Clearly, Wright parted ways with celebrations of black folk life in the work, apparent in the work of Hughes and Hurston. While he agreed that a racial aesthetic could be discerned in black folk culture with Negro churches as a main institutional arbiter, Wright's analysis focused squarely on the issue of class, which Hurston, Hughes, and Schuyler had only implied. Wright insisted that black writers had to negotiate, to be clear, neither celebrate nor reject the nationalist posture posture of black churches, black communities. Quote, Negro writers must accept the nationalist implications of their lives, not in order to encourage them, but in order to change and transcend them. Wright continued, they must accept the concept of nationalism because in order to transcend it, they must possess it and understand it. Black churches had to be engaged, but only insofar as they could be employed to aid class struggle. He explains, and I'll quote him at length here, with the gradual decline of the moral authority of the Negro church, and with the increasing irresolution which is paralyzing Negro middle-class leadership, a new role is devolving upon the Negro writer. He's being called upon to do no less than create values by which his race is to struggle, live, and die. Guided by an ethic quite different from Du Bois's concern with positive representation, Wright argued that black artists ought to assume the role of race leaders. In fact, they were best situated to assume a mantle previously occupied by preachers. Not only was a racial aesthetic possible, but these writers were uniquely qualified to provide a vision for modern black life, to, quote, create myths and symbols that inspire a faith in life. Given the decline that he observed in the professional class, namely preachers, he encouraged writers to draw upon the ethos of the black masses, the, quote, ideologies and attitudes fostered in this warping way of life. By no means a Christian apologist, Wright maintained that black churches, in particular black popular churches, were a primary force sustaining this racial ethos, and they would have to be engaged in any vision of liberation. That is, quote, in order to transcend it, they must possess it and understand it. My main concern throughout this talk today is all of the different sorts of arguments that are encoded within this range of appeals to what today has been termed Black American popular religion. Whether it's George Haynes's socio-theological rendering of Harlem's churches in favor of those of the black elite, whether it's Langston Hughes's invocation, celebration, and performance of the black Christian vernacular, or George Schuyler's dismissal of the very idea of a distinct Negro church. Zora Neale Hurston's ethnographic work in support of an Africanist interpretation of the Deep South, or Richard Wright's claim for a Marxist position which draws on this popular culture in service of some sort of class revolution. This is the problem of the popular. Not so much popular religion as it's practiced, but how and what arguments it's used in service of towards the end of a racial aesthetic. Thank you.
Josef, thank you so much for your talk. It was very, very enlightening in the way that you talked about black religion as a mediating discourse in culture and race and things of that nature. At the fellowship, the Mellon Fellowship, we're discussing issues around popular religion. One of the things that we wrestle with is exactly what is popular religion? How do we define it? And there are different thoughts around that, and we actually have not come to an agreement on that, so it'll be very interesting to bring this into the discussion, because we start with Weber and this idea of the lower classes are the ones, the popular in the sense of the masses are the ones that stand against this organized religion, and therefore their practices and their beliefs become what we look at as popular religion. There are others who say it's an urban experience. It's what happens among the urban folks and how they articulate and practice that which they call their religious beliefs. There are those who say that if there's magic involved, these practices around magic and cruder, if you will allow me to put that into parentheses, cruder ideas of how life is impacted and moved. And so in the midst of all these discussions, it became very, very interesting that there's a notion of the popular which has to do with the well-liked and the things that are embraced. And I think that Josef's work brings that out, pointing to the different things that are well-liked in the African-American community, that are well-liked in the black community, and how we bring those things into the discussion. And I think what's interesting about what he talks about is the way that religion in the African-American community has impacted the popular versus the popular impacting religion. One of the things I thought that we could discuss a little bit is this idea of aesthetics as the site of inquiry. How we can look at, and what I want to do here may not be fair to you, but what I want to do here is pull in a little of your work around hip hop.
Sure.
Okay? and how we look at the aesthetics of hip hop and how the church, and let me back up for a second. So when we talk about black religion, in this particular context, we've talked about the Christian church by and large. But that cuts off from the discussion a bit about Islam, a bit about African-derived religions and that nature. And I want to open up the discussion a little bit to bring those back in if we may. Okay. So I want to look a little bit about some of the work you've done around hip hop and the aesthetic that the church or religious beliefs, because we start with Islam, I believe, and move into Christianity when we look at hip hop and the popular and religion. And so I was hoping that you could take us there a little bit and talk about how aesthetic has been this mediating discourse in terms of what religion means to this popular.
Right. No, I mean, for me, within kind of the field of the study of African American religion, there's obviously this concern with moving beyond black churches, right? And not just any black churches, but kind of this idea that Dr. King is representative of all black churches, and not that he was a minority movement even within his own leader of kind of minority movement even within his own denomination, right? That led to actual physical fights and death, right? Over the direction of that. I think to turn to the arts provides a space to kind of address the concern with that critique of the political black church, the concern with diversity, religious diversity in diaspora, and over-determining that political narrative. They're all apparent in the arts, in the popular culture. And I think that was, evident in the arguments made by the authors that we addressed today. But, and then as you move forward, right, Hurston's making an argument about black churches to claim that this is really not Christianity as we traditionally understand it. This is really about African-derived ways of being in the world and practices and cosmologies. So even when Christianity dominates the discourse, and that's why I think art is important, there's no avoiding that kind of hegemonic place of privilege of Christianity in the West, and black communities are no exception to that rule, but that's not to say that there aren't a range of other traditions at the same time. The arts allows to recognize the way in which that place of privilege is maintained. I think if we were to even jump halfway to hip hop to the 1960s, I think of Ishmael Reed's powerful essay/poem Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto, right, which is kind of part of this reclaiming of Hurston and her work and celebrating these black folk cultures of the South. But his likening, basically he's celebrating a kind of critique of Christianity, the performative traditions of the African diaspora in their presence in the United States, but he does it all through the metaphor, culminating with the final statement of, you can't keep a good church down, right? So that there's somehow this church within the African American church that really bears witness to an African presence and not the theology assigned, right, to Christian orthodoxy. Does that make sense? Now, so what's interesting to me is the way in which that kind of appeal to some idea of popular culture serves any number of arguments, right? Alain Locke makes an appeal to Africa in The New Negro, but then he's also making a claim to connect it to this modernizing folk spirit, which is indebted to German Romanticism, right? So that within popular, in this discourse of the spirit, there's an appeal to Africa at the same time that there's an appeal to the best of the West. And spirit becomes this kind of mediating language to think about all these different ways of mediating the popular. And, I didn't get to hip hop. I can say if.
No, that's great because, what I'm thinking about is that it appears to me sometimes that when we talk about popular religion, particularly as it relates to the African American church, that what we're talking about are practices that make larger culture, if you will, the mainstream culture of America uncomfortable. Okay? And that's really what's happening here. It's not so much, I have a struggle. I have a struggle with this notion of popular religion. Okay? I have a very real struggle with it because it seems as if those who have the ability and the power to define what religion is, what popular official religion is, looks to things that are just counter to the things that they hold true and dear and just label it as popular. Does that make sense? So the folks who determine what is high-class elite religion are the ones who determine what is popular versus the people who are practicing on a different level making that decision. Because from what you said, it is very clear that the black church wasn't a monolith. Right? And so whereas those outside the black church would look to all black church practices as popular religion, those within the black church would make a distinction between elite religion and more common religion, right? So the reason I wanted to bring in the hip hop piece of it was because in your work you talk about how the spirituality that exists, that may or may not be referred to in the religious sense, is very fluid. Right, it starts with this Islam 5%er idea, and its fluidity moves into this Christian notion with Kanye West and those guys, and it's mediated through popular, right? And what is a popular with any group of people at any given time? So that's why I wanted to try and draw that in a little bit more.
Right. Well, no. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I was saying, who gets to determine what is popular and how does that move?
Right. I mean, on one hand, right, popular and black popular religion is understood in distinction to the modern, right? Yet at the same time, the formation of kind of modern aesthetic, modern identity was always dependent upon, right, some understanding of the popular adapted for its own interest. I mean, that's what I think you see in a number of these figures that I spoke about today. In terms of, to jump up and to try to say something about your question around hip hop, what was interesting to me is we track the kind of history of hip hop and its emergence and its own creation narrative of itself as opposition to the mainstream in its own passageway from kind of the voice of young people, young black and brown people in the Bronx, to now arguably the most popular form of popular culture the world over. Right. We can see the ways in which different religious sensibilities become more prominent. Which is not to say that there hasn't always been, prior to Jesus Walks in 2003, a Christian voice, right? MC Hammer, his first crossover album, had a Christian song at the end. How many of y'all remember Son of the King? Right, right, maybe one, right? Exactly, right? Not very popular at the time, right? Which said something about, right, which kind of religious sensibilities, not because of necessary allegiance to an orthodoxy attached to a tradition, were more prominent, right? So at the time that Hammer's album comes out, a more prominent religious voice was that attached to the black identity articulated through the Nation of Islam or various formations of black Islam, right? And you can also, I think in that way, you see hip hop in that move from, say, Islam in the late 80s and early 90s as a central voice to someone like Kanye West, even with Lupe Fiasco's remix of Jesus Walks, Muhammad Walks, he cites Creflo Dollar, Yolanda Adams, and Smokey Norfolk, right? These are three of the most popular Christian earners, in addition to their culture, right? I mean, so, right, the way in which through the market, but and likewise, in the 90s, arguably the more prominent black religious leader was someone like Farrakhan, who's able to convene on the Mall million plus, right? Roughly the same time that Jesus Walks, who's on the cover of Time magazine? Pastor of the largest black megachurch in the country. T.D. Jakes. So, right, hip hop, I think in some ways, at least what makes it to the mainstream, there's always much more going on, mirrors, right, this broader dimensions of what's going on in American popular culture and black culture, and which speaks to, and I think also foregrounds the way in which popular culture, the category, as a descendant of a genealogy that goes back to ideas of folklore and local culture, right, and the transformation of media cultures over the course of the 20th century, right, the role of the media in the market in kind of the way presentations of this popular.
One more point, and then we're going to open up for questions for everybody. Going back to some of the people that you talked about and looking at their lineage, you know, James Weldon Johnson played on an idea that Du Bois had around double consciousness, and the phrase I believe was double audience, but I'm not sure. But he talks about that every black writer has to keep in mind two audiences, right? The audience of their people and the audience of the other, right? And I wonder, as you go through your genealogy of people in the black American popular vein as it relates to black American religion, ending with Richard Wright, do you see a movement away from this notion of writing to a double audience? Is it that as they progress along with this notion, you know, that they're getting to the point where they're like, we're not trying to appeal to the other. We just want to write something that is particular for us. So we're no longer mimicking just white religion, if you will, but we're bringing in these African retentions, or even in the rejection of the African retentions, we're saying this is unique, this is ours alone, and we're ignoring or excluding that other audience. Yeah,
I mean, I would say on one hand, I mean, certainly, right, that's Richard Wright's argument, in part, in Blueprint for Negro Writer, is that the problem of the failures of the alleged Harlem Renaissance is that it was too concerned with white patrons and a white audience, rather than directing literature to, right? That's what it's called for in the essay, if we read it straightforward, is to encourage black writers to assume that mantle and create literature that will orient the masses, the popular, towards the direction of, right, a Marxist revolution, if you will, right? And I'm being a little bit overly simplistic in that regard. Yet at the same time, I think I want to resist the notion, at least in interpreting that phenomena, of reinforcing a kind of very clear dichotomy between black and white, right? So that while Marx, I mean, to read the same year that Blueprint for Negro Writing comes out, Uncle Tom's Children comes out, and to look at the ways in which Richard Wright blends in Marxist propaganda with the fictional portrayals of life in the black cell, right? Those things are not easily disentangled, right? Mary Louise Pratt uses the idea of the contact zone, the way in which cultures interact and connect and overlap amidst conditions of highly asymmetrical relations of power, right? But to draw a thin line and disentangle black from white in the formation of the American West, I think that is somewhat of a implausible. And that's not to, I mean, I like the way Stuart Hall formulates this in his classic essay on black popular culture, when he tracks the way in which the spirituals emerge in the fields to their performance in concerts hall around the world, around through groups like the Fifth Jubilee Singers, right? There is a particular context and cultural inheritance evidence in the birth of the spirituals that will always be borne witness to, even if it's at the height of American-mediated popular culture, right? That is distinctly the black and black popular culture, as Stuart Hall says, but at the same time, right? I mean, Du Bois is negotiating that too. It's message of the slaves, but it's also American, the original American art, cultural form.
Questions? If anyone has any questions, we ask you to come to the podium, to the mic. Can we give the mic to her? Yeah.
So I lift it up, or you can hear me. Josef, I just had a quick question for you about the writers that you look at in the 20s talking about religion. Around the same time, there's the emergence of a kind of mass market for black music, the race record market, and we know they record the blues, the classic blues singers, but they also record all these kind of semi-religious things like sermons and songs and things like that. And I was wondering if you see any relationship between what these writers are theorizing and these religious recordings for a more broad popular audience that might also speak to this question of black popular religion.
That's a great question. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I actually, a colleague and good friend of mine is writing a book on the most prolific recorder of race sermons at the time, Reverend J.M. Gates, from country at Georgia, and then becomes a pastor of two prominent churches in Atlanta at the same time. And yet, I mean, I think part of, right, this commercial culture is a central piece to the formation of these representations of black popular culture. But I think it also is why those stories are not at the front and center of how we recount that moment, is that those folk, and I think this is one of the kind of ironies often of religious practice and negotiation of religious communities to modern technologies, is that the figures who show up in the literature are often the Adam Clayton Powell Sr., the Reverend Ransom, these kind of new Negro clergy, right, who are embracing the discourses of modernity, the social sciences, yet are at the same time reluctant to embrace these novel technologies of the masses, right? So you don't get a story, right? I mean, there's much has been written about figures like Powell and Ransom, but not about J.M. Gates, who, one might argue, had as his audience the masses, or the more popular dimension, and not that kind of talented tenth of new Negro Christians. I think, and someone like Gates is, at the same time, in a more sophisticated way, working through, right, who records records about chain stores and critiquing the way in which these large institutions are kind of harming local communities, right? This is the idea of the popular, but that never makes it because of the kind of the way in which the market determines what gets out there, right? His sermon, Mannish Woman, makes it out there, but his sermon about the chain stores doesn't. Thank you, Farrah. That's a great question.
Any other questions?
I have a question. So I'm wondering if you could maybe think about or discuss how a notion of the late Clyde Wood blues epistemology and how you see these continuities passing through from generation to generation in terms of what you might call a popular aesthetic and a religious or black aesthetic and black religious practices as one of class. And so, you know, you have this emergence of like the blues epistemology based out of class, and then it's perpetuated over time, passed through generation, through certain aesthetic modalities, but then at the same time you have this tension with the popular where things become commodified, and once it crosses some sort of like imaginary class line, right, it starts to lose some sort of traction, and you see this loss of certain type of blues epistemology.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, there's a way in which popular, and this, I mean, right, this is the argument George Schuyler's making at the time, right? This isn't about race. This is about a particular group, right, of folks at a particular class status. And there's a way in which the discourse around popular is always classed, right, if not made explicit. And I think that's apparent in these folk. And I think it changed, I mean, that's, right, part of the argument of always behind this racial aesthetic is that somehow the aesthetic is going to reflect and represent the everyday experiences of the popular, the masses of, in this case, black folk. But in light of, I mean, so on one, right, if you look at even two figures in the Harlem Renaissance, one who I discussed here, in Langston Hughes, and another who doesn't, Sterling Brown, professor of English for a long time at Howard University, right? They're both offering these portraits of the black popular. But for Hughes, whose focus is the North, it's the urban proletariat, right? Whereas for Sterling Brown, it's kind of the Southern road, Black South, right? We see that also in someone like Gene Toomer's representation. And that certainly shifts, right? So by the time we get to Ishmael Reed, who I mentioned earlier, or Amiri Baraka, the artist of the Black Power movement, the popular is these urban, right? In light of 30+ years of migration, the popular is connected to the class that's concentrated in the urban ghetto, right? It's kind of a rereading of the Moynihan narrative in the favor of a kind of oppositional black identity, right? A critique of Moynihan's framing, right? To highlight the accent, the agency of that class of black folk. Yeah, and I mean, I think it's the next book project, and this is where I think Kanye, in addition to Jesus Walks, it's standing in a line that can be at least traced back to 1985 or 80, was it a late 80s essay by Trey Ellis, who teaches up at Columbia, entitled The New Black Aesthetic, right? If in the past, black identity has always been assumed to be authentically located within the poor, what have you, Trey Ellis wants to say, no, my parents are both Ivy League faculty, I went to boarding school, and I'm still black, right? I mean, you see Kanye doing in a very, I think, perhaps, I mean, in a mass form of hip hop, saying, you know what, right? I suffer from all these middle class anxieties, but I'm still hip hop. I'm still real. Which in the past, right, hip hop was also always understood as emerging from the hood, and solely that way. So yeah, that's a great question.
So I have a question thinking about the kind of phenomenon of it'd be harsh to use appropriation, but kind of the phenomenon of the blue-eyed soul kind of aesthetic, and this idea of kind of white performers adopting this black aesthetic, and often very much taken from the black church, thinking about, you know, so-called white soul singers, those aesthetics are very much there. And I think currently there's a narrative of, it's the market of it, you know, there's money in making this kind of music, but I don't think there's always been that push or that idea, but there always has been that phenomenon of the white performer kind of taking on the black aesthetic, especially rooted in the black church. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of going back to maybe the Harlem Renaissance or even before, and kind of explaining kind of a little bit how that trope has evolved, because that's something I think about a lot, and thinking about how popular culture is taken from, or popular media is taken from black popular culture.
Yeah, I mean, this is right. This is also, I think, part of what Richard Wright's concern is, right? I mean, so in debates over historiography over the Harlem Renaissance, you know, on one hand, early scholarship deems it a failure because it didn't mobilize a mass political movement, right? That it was co-opted by outside white forces, and Houston Baker goes so far as to argue that, well, you're reading it wrong. Harlem was actually a maroon community, right? Where the conversation is around fostering this unique black community. I think certainly, there's always been cultural exchanges, right? And we know the popular narrative of Elvis Presley stealing rock and roll, right? And we know, right, and black presence in the formation of these novel forms. And I think what's interesting to me is the way in which even now black hip hop artists are, you think of Mos Def, Black on Both Sides, where he's rewriting that popular history, or even in that Trey Ellis essay, reclaiming like the black rock music that's saying, no, this is our heritage as well. And in light of the market forces, which were overly right, which black, in a power broking way, there was very little black presence until kind of these hip hop moguls, right? So that kind of power dynamic, which is allowed for that co-opting or appropriation, I think is a very real dynamic in terms of who has historically maintained control over the emergence of that commercial culture and over the consolidation of media conglomerates in more recent years. And which has led to, I think, now a lot of African-American artists learning from that history and insisting on their own boutique labels or efforts to control their rights. I think there's a recent story around Chuck D fighting to get back the rights to certain aspects of, I'm messing the story up, but that, right, I think African-American artists have learned from that history to kind of negotiate those power imbalances historically, yeah. So.
This is the same kind of question, but from a different angle, I guess. And I apologize for the telephone going off. I was interested in your contrast between spirit and church, and it reminded me of this classic sociological framework of sect and church, and the argument that sects eventually end up as denominations. My own PhD was on Methodism, and I mean, Methodism starts off as a form of popular religion and ends up as a mainstream. So my question is really, I mean, how does the spirit keep getting renewed and renovated? And to what extent can spirit avoid market, which is, an aspect of this? I mean, pessimistically, it seems to me that modern forms of spirit very quickly end up in the market end of things and become kind of naturalized and mainstreamed. And I mean, it's an impossible question, really, but I mean, to what extent can spirit survive late capitalism or financial capitalism is really
no, that's, well, I think you've just framed the question right. And I guess I mean, so in the larger project where I talk about these spiritual grammars and kind of trace a genealogy of the way in which spirit functioned in these debates, I'm stopping here at 1970 roughly for this current book project. But in the next project, we'll move forward. And what's interesting, right, you see folks like Locke, folks like Du Bois, the folks that I mentioned here, appealing to spirit, right? As I kind of frame a racial discourse in contrast, right, to the majority, if you will. In the 60s and 70s, you have folks like Larry Neal, Amiri Baraka, a range of other figures associated with the Black arts movement that shows up in Tony Cade's anthology, Black Woman, arguing for a new spirituality, right? That, again, this Ishmael Reed idea that there's something, kind of a spirit within the church that's been forced underground by virtue of the forces of commodification and racial oppression, right? That's been drained out of the true church. But then when you get up to this group or cohort of young artists and intellectuals that are emerging at the same time as Trey Ellis in this powerful piece, the late Joe Wood, his introduction to Malcolm X and Our Own Image, right, kind of reframes and is very cognizant of this history of genealogy, right? And he uses Malcolm X's narrative, right, in the way in which Malcolm has been appropriated for so many different purposes, which our own Professor Dyson has written on eloquently and may have contributed to that volume as well. I'm not certain if I remember correctly in that regard. But in accounting for this history, in relationship with the history of Christian iconography, right, basically, Wood concludes in the introduction that spirit is such a vacuous term that it ultimately is subject to the very right? It can be used to claim German Romanticism, it can be used to claim Africa, it can be used to claim a Marxist position. Ultimately, something that fluid and vacuous will not stay, right, will ultimately end up being co-opted. I think within hip-hop artists, there is also, and I don't know whether it will prove more effective, an embrace of the idea, rather than this notion of spirit as fully oppositional, the idea of a kind of complicated negotiation of these market forces in a way that still is able to communicate what might be seen as the core essence if we want to go into an essentialist argument about that spirit, which is not where I'm trying to go. But that's the argument being made, right, in a kind of embrace of a layperson's complexity theory. So someone like Talib Kweli, in resistance to just being, right, if conscious hip-hop is the kind of spiritual representation, now someone like who's been bracketed like had been bracketed like Talib Kweli as a conscious artist will say, forget conscious, I'm trying to be complicated, right? So that his message, right, can reach a broader audience, but still it somehow hold on to that core. I think Jay-Z was doing this in different ways before, how to represent the hood, but still have, right, whether or not that itself gets just kind of totally sucked in by those market forces, I don't know. But I think that's one response that is a little different, to try to negotiate that very dynamic, to maintain that significant representation of the popular, but still engage in a critical way the forces, those market forces. Thank you, Brian.
You said you didn't want to go into Aretha, but I'm going to make you go back to it.
All right.
Obviously, popular culture has popular religious aspects in it, and I guess part of our conversation as being part of the committee, I guess I keep getting stuck on this idea of the popular, but haven't really gone into so much as defining religion and what is now religion and what constitutes religion within the context of today's culture. So yes, it's popular culture. Is it popular religion? Is it something else, or is it both?
Say that one more time.
It's obviously popular culture.
Yeah, yeah.
It has aspects of popular religion, right? Because you're seeing the spiritual within her performance. And then I guess the question becomes, do we look at popular religion as a subset of popular culture, and how do we begin to define it? Or is it both? Is it not an and or, but a both sort of situation?
Yeah.
I don't know. These are
No, it's a great question. I think right, religion as all aspects of culture, right? Religion as a cultural phenomena is subject to the same historical forces, to go back to Brian's point around how late capital, right, influences everything. I mean, we can see, what was the argument on the Atlantic cover story maybe 4 or 5 years ago by Hannah Rosen? Did Christianity cause the crash, right? No, right? There's these economic forces, and Christianity reflects that in the same way, right? But the point, right, and you could say that, so the same thing with someone like Tyler Perry. At the same time that late capital is taking its present form over the last 40 years, is an emergence of an incredibly lucrative Christian music, Christian book, right? That reflects this development, right? Right. There are, in a more broader world, right, new medias are reshaping the way in which Islam's practiced. I think about Charles Hirschkin's work on cassette sermons and how that reshapes lay people, but also clergy's presentation, right? Muslim clergy presentation of those sermons. So, I think religion as one aspect of culture is part and parcel of a broader range of cultural forms that are inevitably, necessarily shaped in these communities are negotiating the current historical, social, economic landscape.
Because I guess in one sense it's an entryway, could be an entryway for some people into the more established church, but can we actually look at that as religion or spirituality in and of itself? Just, and I think that's part of the bigger question is what constitutes religion in today's culture, and does it always have to be based on a specific text, which is what always gets argued, particularly within a Christian context.
Right. No, and I think religious communities are always, in addition to reading their sacred text, reading the social landscape. And while we might not necessarily be fans of the prosperity gospel, right, we can recognize the kind of theological creativity that rereads the Christian tradition in light of the triumph of late capital, right? And have to take that seriously in light of the relatively diminished public presence of a religious left. Which had, right, and I think that's the irony of the way in which religious communities negotiate these market forces, right? A lot of religious communities have reconciled themselves in a way that has led to enormous congregations, which raises all sorts of troubles and problems and questions for us who study religion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
which in some ways circles back for me to the challenge that I'm having with the idea of the popular, right?
Yeah.
The popular being these masses typically defined as the poor masses, right? In terms of today's vernacular, the 99%, right? Yeah. So I would argue maybe they're not in the 99%, maybe they're in the 59%, but what happens when what you have been deeming popular religion, right, popular culture, the progenitors, the people who created, the people who bring it to the forefront are now in the 1%, right? Mm. So you have this situation with hip-hop with the Jay-Z's, the Diddy's, the Beyoncé's, the Kanye's, or you have on the religion side, in the black church, the T.G. Jakes, the Creflo Dollars, the Juanita Bynums, right, who are looked at as people who move forward this notion of black popular religion, black popular culture, but they're in the 1%, not in the 99 or the 59%. Does that then change the definition of the popular, which the popular has always been those masses, the people who are in the quote-unquote oppressed classes? Does this affect how we approach the whole notion of popular? Do we redefine it?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think what your question kind of just clarifies is the kind of a necessarily healthy suspicion towards what the popular claims to signal and what it actually does, right? We can think of all the invocations on behalf of the people that really are only in the interest of the individual making the proclamation for the people. But at the, so I think, I mean, there's no way of getting around it. And at the same time, right, I think at this point, there's enough work that clarifies that a line between elite and popular, or the line between the 99 and the 1, is just especially in the way in which media developments have taken form, is that even folks who are perceived to be representative of the popular, their identities don't exist in a vacuum from those media forces, right? We can think of young people who construct their identity into relationships in relationship to certain fantasies that are on portrayal in popular hip hop. Right? Right, and that's what a majority of those who at least purchase and consume are white suburban kids who construct part of their identity through representations of black light. So there's layers of mediation between what is perceived to be the popular that has consequences both for those who broker the popular for great gain and those who might be understood as the popular. I don't know there's any way out of that other than to be attentive to the genealogy of ideas around the popular that goes back to, you know, folklore and folklore and local studies. I mean, think of William Christian's work on popular religion. I think it's in Spain, 15th, 16th century Spain. I mean, it's to be attentive to the way, and what I hope, in part, what my work does, is to be attentive to the way these few figures are part of that discourse of deploying some sort of notion of the black popular religion for a variety of sorts of arguments, to claim that there is blackness, to claim that there isn't, to a better class cause. I mean, we have to be pay close attention to what's being argued on behalf of the people or the popular.
Well, thanks so much. This is a great, great, great presentation. I think it's done a lot for us to broaden our understanding of popular religion and the genealogy of Black American popular religion. I'm excited to hear our next speaker, Professor Michael Eric Dyson, and how he'll pick up on this idea of the popular and what it represents. And thank you all for your attentiveness, and will you join me in thanking Josef Sorett for a wonderful presentation.
Yeah.
During the break, we're going to get the rest of the Aretha video.